Good day. Today, Saturday, 9th December, we move closer to the end of the year, to the holiday season, and we also see that the political and diplomatic timetable process is intensifying and accelerating. So yesterday we had the predicted announcement by President Putin that he is going to be standing for the presidency next year, the Russian presidency next year. We've seen all the major diplomatic moves that the Russians have been at the center of taking place over the last few days. We have some important political developments in the United States. We see the failure of Congress to approve further funding for Ukraine, a failure which is now starting to look increasingly like a refusal. We see more political problems for the president himself with the indictment of his son. We've seen another vote in the Security Council with the United States isolated, vetoing a resolution, a draft resolution, calling for a ceasefire in the fighting in Gaza. Now, it should be said that even though it would be wrong to say that all of these events are directly connected to each other, they do come together, and in that expression deriving from that film, I neither like the film nor the expression, a perfect storm, but they are coming together, and in political terms, for the administration, they are generating what might be called a perfect storm. But I'm going to start today with the situation in Ukraine, as I traditionally do. In my opinion, it is the conflict in Ukraine that remains the single most important one geopolitically, and that, I think, is the right place to begin. Now, let me, in doing so, briefly run through the latest developments on the battlefronts. We're now, by the way, increasingly in winter weather. There's lots of snow, pictures and films that are coming out of the battlefronts often show snow-covered landscapes. I'm not sure that the snow is there in every place, but for the record, there have also been very heavy snowfalls much further to the north and east, in St. Petersburg and Moscow, and I believe in Kiev itself, and in Moscow at least, and in St. Petersburg, we're now looking at classic Russian winter conditions. And this, of course, is having an effect on the way the war is being conducted. It doesn't prevent offensive action. We've seen that the Russians pushed forward right across the front line throughout the Rabotino period. There's every indication that they are continuing to push forward, even as winter closes in. But it is the winter conditions are affecting the way in which the conflict is being conducted from this point forward. And there's a number of quick things to say. Firstly, the winter, the lower temperatures, obviously, one effect is that they're going to start to harden the ground, making it easier for tracked vehicles to move across country, opening up the fields and not just the main roads. However, alongside that, winter means less daylight, obviously. It also means that there's more likely to be snowstorms and, of course, lower temperatures, which is particularly arduous for soldiers on the ground. And, of course, here a lot depends on who's better kitted out to fight in the winter. The third thing that it means is that the trees, the foliage now, is disappearing from many of the trees. And this is important because foliage has been used by both sides over the course of this war to conceal their troops and their military equipment from the other, and with thousands, tens of thousands of drones now operating across the battlefield, it means that the advantage in concealment provided by the foliage, even though it's not completely gone, has been substantially diminished. And last but not least, the snow conditions probably make it easier to spot soldiers moving across the battlefields. This is something I don't know very much about, but I'm guessing that the contrast between a snow-covered landscape and moving soldiers and the shadows they cause is easier to spot for anybody looking out for them. So the winter will impose its own conditions, and I would suggest that in this kind of atmosphere, these conditions, it will be the Russians who will be the major beneficiaries. Firstly, because of course they are, as we know, on the advance, and some of the benefits provided by winter, it seems to me, work more to the force that is conducting the offensive than the defence, in the sense that it's easier to spot the defence lines. The foliage doesn't protect the defenders to the extent that it did. Secondly, the Russians, by universal consent, now have far more drones operating over the skies of Ukraine than Ukraine does, and therefore have a better sense of what is going on the battlefields. And the Russians are proving increasingly successful in jamming Ukrainian drones. And also, the Russians, all the indications suggest, are much better kitted out, certainly this winter. And they also apparently, their men are apparently younger and in better physical shape than the Ukrainians are, who have been fighting for a long time, who are exhausted by all accounts, who are suffering from manpower shortages, and who are apparently significantly older, with most Ukrainian soldiers on the battle lines now in their mid-40s or older still. Anyway, that's a brief statement about the climate. What's actually been going on? Well, more of the same is the answer, though, again, the trajectory of travel is very clear. Firstly, on the Dnieper River, the trap that the Ukrainians made for themselves by landing troops in Krinky continues to operate. The Russians continue to shell and bomb this place. The Ukrainians have been unable to break out from it. The Ukrainian losses have been appalling. As I think I said in one recent video, there was a report that the Russians destroyed 19 Ukrainian boats on one day. Ukrainians trying to keep this bridgehead in Krinky reinforced and supplied. And there was that report from a soldier in Krinky talking to the BBC, saying that sometimes, not always, the Ukrainians are able to evacuate their wounded from Krinky, but they've given up any longer trying to evacuate their dead from the village. That was what a Ukrainian soldier said to the BBC. So the conditions in Krinky must be getting horrendous. And with every building now in this area, which constitutes the Ukrainian bridgehead, essentially demolished, the cover from the winter, the sub-zero temperatures, the snow, all of that provided to the soldiers as a result of having buildings around them. Well, that must be going, and the conditions in which these soldiers find themselves must be becoming increasingly appalling. Now, I've noticed that some people, Rebar specifically, have been talking about the winter leading to eventually to the icing up of the Dnieper River. and making it easier for the Ukrainians to send men across the ice into Krinky, easing the supply situation. Now, that may be true. I'm going to say this, though, again, and here I'm less confident than I am on previous points like this that I've talked about. But again, as somebody who's undertaken quite a lot of walking in country conditions, I would say that sending large groups of men across a river, an iced up river, presumably at night, would be a rather more complicated and difficult and dangerous exercise than perhaps Riba understands. I'm not going to devote too much time to this, and I should say that I've never attempted anything like that myself, and so here I'm not speaking from direct experience, but walking across ice, an iced up river, is widely recognised, I think it's widely acknowledged, to be a dangerous thing to do. And of course, especially given that temperatures will change and there will be odd thaws, and there'll be places where the ice is likely to be thinner than in other places. And of course, the Russians are hardly likely to be idle. They will be still keeping their drones operating, observing soldiers trying to cross this river. And of course, all of this will be happening whilst the shells are falling and the missiles are being launched and all that kind of, or the FPV drones are closing in, all of that going on. And just to also add that until the river, of course, fully ices up, it's conceivable. I mean, I don't know anything much about the conditions in this particular river, the Dnieper, but it's conceivable that ice flows might actually complicate supply rather than simplifying it. I would just make one quick guess, which is that on the one hand, I suspect this river is relatively shallow. There's quite a lot of islands that will probably help in icing up the river and might make this resupply that Reba is talking about more simple. Against that, this area is fairly close to the sea. That will mean higher temperatures than you might find further north. It might also mean that there's less. That might mean that there is less ice, and that the weather conditions, therefore, are more unpredictable. Anyway, for the record, I don't think that this is quite as straightforward as Reba might think. I don't think it's as straightforward as some people in the West might be thinking also. But anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this. I don't pretend to be an expert on walking on ice. Anyway, that's Krinky. Further east, it's looking as if the area of Ukraine's major effort during its summer offensive, the area south of Orekhov in the Rabotino, Verbovoye area, well, it's increasingly looking as if Ukrainian positions there are now being severely undermined, that the Russians are incrementally recapturing territory that the Ukrainians had captured over the course of the summer and early autumn, captured at horrendous loss. There's been reports that the Russians have either re-entered Rabotino or are literally a few meters away from Rabotino itself. They were able to capture that abandoned Leopard 2 close to Rabotino. It seems that most of the Ukrainian forces in this area have been withdrawn and have been redeployed to Avdeyevka, and we'll come to that, what's going on there shortly. But anyway, it looks as if the Russians are gradually and incrementally recapturing all of this territory around Rabotino, around Verbovoye, and there's even some suggestions that the Ukrainians might eventually accept the failure here and pull all their forces back and establish defense lines further north around Orekhov and Malaya Tochmaka, another village which had been used as a launch position for the Ukrainians as they advanced further south during the summer, in which case all of the ephemeral gains of the summer offensive will have been reversed. I'm going to return to the offensive, the summer offensive, Ukraine summer offensive, shortly. And if we go a little further east again, it seems that the Russians are continuing to push forward in various places along the Vremivka salient, that we're not hearing a huge amount about what is going on there. And the major battles continue to be in Avdeyevka. And the Ukrainians have again confirmed that the Russians have concentrated a force of around 40,000 men around Avdeyevka. There are contradictory reports about what is going on in the Stepovoye Berdichi area. Dima, at the military summary channel, claims that the Russians have pulled back from Stepovoye. This is basically on the strength of some geolocations. Geolocations of Ukrainian attacks on Russian troops and on presence of some Ukrainian soldiers. Other Russian reports continue to insist that the Russians continue to be present in Stepovoye. My own impression is that it's the same as what we've been seeing for several weeks now. An intense encounter battle taking place in and around this village of Stepovoye and Berdichi. The Russians have captured the railway. They have not succeeded in consolidating control of Berdichi. The Ukrainians are launching repeated counterattacks to prevent them doing so. But the Ukrainians in the process are suffering heavy losses, especially in armoured vehicles, though there is no doubt that the Russians are suffering losses also. And again, it does look a little like attrition. And as I've discussed many times in many programs, as Brian Beletic has also discussed many times in many programs, as has generally become acknowledged, attrition, when it happens in this war, consistently works it ultimately in favour of the Russians. So lots of fighting around Stepovoye. But of course, further south, around Avdeyevka itself, it does seem as if the situation is different. It seems that the Russians have been making further headway in the area of the slag heap and the coke factory, that they're pushing steadily into the heart, or rather towards the heart, of Avdeyevka's metropolitan area, its residential area, and that they're also doing so increasingly from the industrial zone, from the southwest. Again, let me reiterate, it may take time, but the trajectory of travel, just as was the case in Bakhmut, is working in one direction. Sooner or later, Avdeyevka is all but certain to fall. Now, over the course of the Battle of Bakhmut, many people, when I said that Bakhmut would eventually fall, many people wrote, put comments on the threads of my programs, saying that it was taking the Russians an impossibly long time, that this was a massive delay in the Russian advance over Bakhmut. They treated the failure of the Russians to capture Bakhmut in a few weeks as some sort of Ukrainian victory. I think it is now universally acknowledged that it was, on the contrary, a disaster, that the number of men and machines that Ukraine sacrificed in trying to defend Bakhmut severely weakened the Ukrainian military and put it in a worse position when the summer fighting came and when it sought to launch its offensive. So I have every reason to think the same is true of the situation in Avdeyevka. We see that broken and exhausted Ukrainian brigades, like the 47th Mechanized Brigade, which is in urgent need of rest and reinforcement and reconstruction, have had to be rushed to defend the situation in Avdeyevka. Troops from the Zaporozhye region, the Rabotino, Verbovoye region, have had to be hurriedly redeployed to Avdeyevka, enabling Russian gains to be made in that area of Ukraine's summer offensive. We see that troops have also been redeployed to Avdeyevka from the Bakhmut area, and the Russians, as a result, have been making significant advances in Bakhmut. More Ukrainian soldiers are being fed into what is now rapidly becoming yet another meat grinder, the meat grinder in Avdeyevka, taking the place of the meat grinder that we saw in Bakhmut. And of course, there's always the same narrative that the Russians are suffering extremely high losses in Avdeyevka. It's exactly the same narrative that we heard in Bakhmut, that the Russians were suffering extremely high losses in Bakhmut. In Bakhmut, by the way, that was true, largely as a consequence, I think, a product of the tactics, especially towards the later part of the fighting, that the Wagner organization followed. But even allowing for that, the losses the Ukrainians suffered in Bakhmut appear to have been significantly greater, and the Ukrainians are not in a position to replace those losses. And the same is playing out in Avdeyevka again, though I suspect that the Russian losses here, proportionately, are less than they were in the fighting in Bakhmut. So there we go, another meat grinder operating in Avdeyevka, a meat grinder which is consuming more and more of a Ukrainian army, which is weaker now than it was last winter when it was fighting in Bakhmut. And of course, all of this happening even as the Russian army gradually grows in power and strength. So prolonging the fight for Avdeyevka may not be playing out ultimately in Ukraine's favor. And talking about Bakhmut, more news, more Russian advances there. There's been all kinds of geolocations of Russian soldiers. Dima at the Military Summary channel gives lots of details about these things. But suffice to say that we now have more confirmation of the Russians capturing more of the high ground on both flanks, both the northern and southern flanks around Bakhmut. It seems as if they are working towards an operation to storm Bogdanovka. It seems that they have either fully secured the area around Klashevka or are coming close to doing so. As I've discussed in previous programs, if Bogdanovka falls, if the Russians capture Bogdanovka, then it seems to me judging from what I can see of the map, in my inexpert view, that the Battle of Bakhmut at that point is all but over, that any possibility for the Ukrainians to retain their positions around Bakhmut disappears. Probably they would be obliged to withdraw to Chasov Yar. Chasov Yar is said to be undefendable, at least that was what a Ukrainian soldier told the Western media during the fighting last year. Once Chasov Yar is recaptured, that will bring the Russians apparently to the banks of another canal. And my own guess is that for the moment at least, over the course of the fighting this winter, that is where the Russians would probably decide to stop. And elsewhere, further north, always the reports from the Kupiansk, Liman, Svatovo area, the Oskol River, much more sketchy than those that we get about the fighting further south. But all the indications are that there again, the Russians incrementally pushing forward, advancing more rapidly over the last few days in the Liman area than they have in other places. There's been lots of fighting, apparently, for control of Sinkovka itself. There's reports that the Russians control the northern part of this village. I saw a video of Russian helicopter gunships flying above Sinkovka, at least I think it was Sinkovka, which, if true, by the way, strongly suggests that the Ukrainians must be under intense pressure in that village, and that their air defense system there has all but broken down, and that the Ukrainian troops in Sinkovka are short of man-pants. I'm not, by the way, entirely sure that that was Sinkovka. But anyway, just say. But anyway, more fighting going on there. And it's clear again that in order to hold the line in Kupiansk, in Liman, the Ukrainians have had to tap into their remaining reserves, deploying troops from other parts of the front lines, trying to hold their positions in Kupiansk and Liman and along the Oskol River, is causing the Ukrainians to suffer more losses, to experience further attrition, which is, I suspect, what the Russians want to do. That is Russia's plan. Now, there were reports yesterday that the Russians launched the first cruise missile strike of the winter. And I've seen reports that the Ukrainians claimed that up to 19 missiles, cruise missiles, were launched by the Russians, and that 14 of those were shot down, meaning that 5 got through. Of course, I've expressed many times my deep cynicism about those claims. I read a report recently, by the way, in, of all places, Epoch Times, a US media publication, which can sometimes be quite interesting. But anyway, Epoch Times said that even Epoch Times, which I believe strongly supports Ukraine, was saying that these Ukrainian claims to have shot down so many Russian missiles, cruise missiles and drones, that they were incredible, that they made absolutely no sense, and that they were not consistent with the facts on the ground. And this report in Epoch Times unusually even challenged straight out Ukraine's claims to have been shooting down Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. For the record, I don't believe Ukraine has ever succeeded in shooting down any Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, though I understand that that has become an article of faith with many Western commentators. But anyway, Epoch Times said that these Ukrainian claims were absurd. Epoch Times tried to balance that by claiming that the Russian claims about the number of drones and missiles that Ukrainians are launching, that they're shooting down, is inflated as well. Here I'm going to push back, actually. The problem, which perhaps the writer at Epoch Times doesn't appreciate, is that in fact we have a lot more information about, the Russians give an awful lot more detailed information, both about Ukrainian missiles and drones that are shot down or brought down by electronic warfare, and those that get through, than the Ukrainians, in my experience, typically do. And we're much better able to corroborate Russian claims from local war reporters or residents in Russian towns and cities and around the various installations where these attacks take place. So I think the Russian reports are, by and large, are reliable. And to be very clear, the Russians have never claimed that they uniformly achieve hit rates of 100%, as the Ukrainians occasionally do. And if we're talking about Storm Shadows and ATACMS missiles, and those kind of missiles which the Ukrainians have been trying to use quite a lot in recent weeks, it's become increasingly clear that the missile strikes that the Ukrainians have been trying to launch with these missiles have been largely ineffective. Not entirely ineffective, but largely so. And that the Russians have become increasingly successful at intercepting and destroying these missiles. And of course, none of that is surprising, because of course the Russian air defense system is of a completely different level of modernity and sophistication, and its operators of a completely different level of training and experience by comparison with those of Ukraine. So anyway, that's my overall summary of the situation on the battlefronts. Now, there's been a lot of discussion now about the kind of tactics that Ukraine should use in the war, especially amongst people in the West, commentators in the West, commentators who support Ukraine. Now, some of these articles, some of these suggestions strike me as being borderline irrational, and I could use stronger words. There was, I thought, an entirely deranged article in Foreign Affairs the other day. I'm not going to cite it or read it, but it said that the West should support Ukraine in launching some great further offensive, that the target ought to be Crimea, Crimea being supposedly the linchpin of the Russian effort. It spoke about massive missile strikes and drone strikes against Crimea. It's brought back up again the topic of the land bridge, cutting the land bridge, deep strikes onto far depths of Russian territory. It said that Ukraine needed to be supplied with aircraft and ATACMS missiles entirely without limit. And effectively, it called, as far as I could see, for a rerun of last summer's failed offensive, only with even more weapons than that offensive was launched with. And by the way, it also called for attacks on the Kerch Bridge, other things of that nature. The problem with all of that is, and this is where I come back to understanding the Russian air defense system, for example. Well, I think the authors of this article don't actually acknowledge is that all of the things that they are recommending have to a great extent already been tried. There's been attacks on the Kerch Bridge, there have been attempts to launch deep strikes far into Russia, there have been missile strikes and drone strikes on Crimea in huge quantities. There's been all of these things. They were happening all through the summer, all through the autumn. And the key point, the critical point to understand, is that they failed. It was unsuccessful in the summer. There's no reason to think it would be any more successful again if it was attempted again, especially given that the Russian military and its air defense system are becoming more experienced and much, much stronger. So anyway, that was the article in Foreign Affairs. Some people still looking for ways to win the war, for Ukraine to go on the offensive. This despite the fact that even General Zaluzhny now appears to acknowledge that breakthroughs of the kind being floated by the people at Foreign Affairs are really out of reach, Ukrainian breakthroughs at least. Much more common are suggestions that Ukraine somehow go on the defensive and keep fighting apparently indefinitely and eventually hope to wear the Russians down. There's been a long article in The Guardian of all places by Emma Ashford, who is described as a senior fellow with the Reimagining US Grand Strategy program at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. I should say that I'm not familiar with this person or indeed with the Stimson Center. The United States has so many think tanks and NGOs, and strategy places and of that kind that I find it impossible to keep up with all of them. But anyway, Emma Ashford concedes that there is declining support for Ukraine across the West, that she concedes also that it's going to be very difficult, but all but impossible, for an offensive to take place. She says that the Biden administration is in urgent need of a plan B, and she suggests that the way to proceed is to give up on the idea of an Ukrainian offensive, of retaking territory, that, in her words, if Ukraine's objective is to retake territory, then any failure by Ukraine to do so is a Russian win almost by default. And then she says that a war of defense for Ukraine and a strategic defeat for Russia is the priority. So Ukraine, therefore, needs to go onto the defensive, and the administration needs to begin a frank and open conversation with Kiev and other European allies about the endgame, the necessary endgame. And fascinatingly and very revealingly, it's clear when you read this article that for Emma Ashford, and I suspect many people in the United States, the ultimate concern is not to win the war, actually, but to change the narrative about the war. The defensive strategy, she says, would build a new narrative that this is a war of defense and Ukraine's survival for Russia, therefore, is a strategic defeat for the Russians, and that whilst this narrative is less aspirational, it is more pragmatic, and that it would transition the war in Ukraine to a lower stakes defensive conflict. And while that might not necessarily be popular, it would put the Biden administration, if re-elected in November, in a stronger position to pursue armistice negotiations in late 2024. So this isn't all about winning any longer. But he's not winning the war in Ukraine any longer. It is about defeating Donald Trump, about winning the election in the United States. You can't win, so go on the defense, pretend that that means that the Russians are experiencing a strategic defeat because Ukraine still survives, change the narrative, build on that narrative in order to win re-election for President Biden in November. My colleague and friend Alex Christoforou and I have very often spoken about the extent to which Western policy today is shaped more around narratives than actual facts. We see this remarkable admission of this fact in this article in The Guardian. I have to say it's unusual for this to be admitted so openly. And for that, at least, for that honesty, I, for one, am grateful to Emma Ashford. Well, suffice to say, narratives don't win wars. I think we should put aside any ideas about what President Biden might or might not achieve in the election in November. We should focus on the realities of the battlefronts. And the key reality, the one which the Western powers are evading, the one which Western commentators are evading, is that Ukraine was defeated this year. It was obviously defeated in Bakhmut, but it has suffered a major strategic military defeat over the course of the summer offensive. And that Ukrainian defeat was, of course, a major Russian victory. The Ukrainians were set the objectives, they conducted their war, the war ended in, the offensive ended in a Ukrainian defeat at the cost of tens of thousands of lives, and it resulted in a major Russian military victory. To assume that by going on the defensive, Ukraine can either reverse the effect of that defeat or replicate the victory which Russia achieved in the summer is, in my opinion, ambitious to the point of being almost fantastic. The Washington Post, as I've discussed extensively in previous programs, Larry Johnson's done a good piece about the Washington Post pieces as well. Anyway, they've discussed at length what went wrong with Ukraine's summer offensive. All of this analysis, all of this discussion, all of the recriminations and the finger pointing miss, for me, the simple and straightforward point. The reason the offensive failed, the reason the Russians gained their victory and the Ukrainians suffered their defeat, is because the Russians had the bigger, better army. They were able to construct fortifications of a complexity and sophistication that the West, that the Americans simply could not imagine, and that their troops and their equipment were better organised, better trained, better motivated, and better led than the Ukrainian troops were. To me, this is straightforward and obvious. You can spend vast amounts of time and energy explaining why this village was captured by that particular day and that village was not. You can complain about the fact that the minefields were denser than you expected. But all of these rationalizations simply beg the question. I mean, for example, just talking about the minefields. If the minefields were far more dense and far better positioned than either the Ukrainians or their Western sponsors imagined, that is only so because the Russians have both the resources to lay massive minefields and the expertise in laying them. It shows that Russian mine laying is of a very high standard and quality indeed. And to me, again, this is obvious, but it's astonishing the extent to which people simply refuse to acknowledge this fact. And if Rabotino was not captured on the first day, and if there was no Ukrainian breakthrough over the course of the remaining 9 days, and if the Ukrainians didn't reach the Sea of Azov or the Black Sea within 2 or 3 months, this is because they were comprehensively outfought on the battlefield by the Russians. Now, until this fact is understood, until it is acknowledged, until Western leaders and Western governments and Western officials and Western journalists face up to the fact that in what was by far the biggest battle of the war up to this point, the summer offensive, Ukraine was comprehensively and disastrously defeated. No correct decisions about what to do will be made. You can construct however many narratives you like, but the facts are the facts, and on the battlefield, they will dictate the outcome. Now, let's come back to the suggestion that Ukraine itself go onto the defensive, establish its own defense lines, hold the Russians back, resist the Russians in the same way that the Ukrainians do. Well, how is that going to be done? Ukraine has no industrial base to speak of. Its construction industry has been brought effectively to a stop. It's apparently short of mines to lay and has little prospect of building more. Remember, the explosives needed to make mines require large amounts of chemicals. Building mines is a tricky thing. You can import chemicals to a certain extent. You can do those to make lots of FPV drones and other types of drones. But even there now, it looks as if the Ukrainians are being swamped by the Russians. How, after the disasters of the summer, the defeat Ukraine suffered over the course of the summer, does Ukraine construct these fortifications? And do they have the knowledge and understanding and expertise to construct fortifications comparable to the ones the Russians created? I say that because, like many people, I refer to the big Russian fortifications, the ones with the dragon's teeth and the pillboxes and the trenches, as the Surovikin line, after General Surovikin, who was briefly Russia's military chief in the late autumn and early winter of 2022-2023. But it seems that the actual person who designed these fortified lines was an engineer general, General Romanchuk, a Russian military officer, who has written books and articles and is an acknowledged expert on the subject. He is the person who knows more about fortified lines and fortifications than perhaps anyone else on the planet. Do the Ukrainians have someone with that level of expertise? Do they have a construction industry remotely comparable to the one that the Russians do? And more to the point, even if the Ukrainians go over to the defense, are they able to defend these fortified lines as well as the Russians did? The Russians have air superiority, which they're certain to retain, whether or not Ukraine eventually gets its F-16s. The Ukrainians today were admitting that so far they still don't have any F-16s. The Russians have more and more fighter jets, more and more bombers. Their bombers are being provided with increasing numbers of precision-guided bombs, where Russian bombers formerly carried one bomb, now they carry two. Before long, it seems there'll be so many of these bombs that they'll be able to carry four. The bombs themselves are getting bigger. Bombs are particularly well adapted to destroying fortifications. They carry far more explosive than artillery shells do. So, and of course, the Russians have far more men, far more machines. They can keep pushing and shelling Ukrainian fortifications. And the Ukrainians, short of men and machines under air attack, it's going to be very difficult for them either to set up the kind of fortified lines now that some people are talking about, or to defend these fortified lines from this point onwards. Now, had things been done differently, had Ukraine chosen to go on to the defensive last year and work to create those fortified lines then possibly, just possibly, they might be in a better position to defend now than they might otherwise have been. I still think it would have been a big stretch, but suffice to say that after the huge losses they've suffered, after the enormous amount of damage that has been done, it's inconceivable, all but inconceivable to my mind, that they would be able to replicate anything like the Russian success of the summer. And I think sooner that again is acknowledged in the West, the better for the West it would be. And perhaps there are some people who do understand this. Now, we're getting an awful lot more reports now about what happened in Congress over the last few days. And yesterday, I touched on Lloyd Austin's astonishing comments to the members of the House of Representatives, talking about how if Ukraine is defeated, the US might find itself going to war with Russia to defend the other NATO countries, that Russia might, in that case, be prepared to attack. It's clear that despite being asked by members of the House of Representatives from the Republican caucus, Lloyd Austin, however, was unable to come up with any strategy for a potential victory in Ukraine. And it seems that the meeting became increasingly acrimonious, and this comment that Lloyd Austin made, and it seems he did make it, appears to have been made in exasperation and anger, and of course its only effect was to make the Republican Congress people angry as well. And of course, when people start to become angry, they become more stubborn. And my sense is that the administration's attempts to try to persuade the Congress people to change their stance on aid for Ukraine, it might have misfired. It might have made that opposition stronger rather than weaker, which of course calls into doubt the entire enterprise. We're now in the weekend. There's going to be 5 working days left before Congress rises on Friday. Of course, that's always assuming that Mike Johnson sticks to his position that Congress will indeed rise next Friday. The British Prime Minister Harold Wilson once said that a week is a long time in politics, so it's possible that there might be a big turnaround in thinking on the part of Republican Congress people over the course of this week. But I have to say, at the moment, I don't see why that shift on the part of Congress Republicans should take place. From their perspective, which is ultimately, I would have assumed, an electoral one, things for the moment appear to be going their way. The president's ratings are falling. The position the Republican Congress people are taking seems to be generally supported amongst the American people, and the president has just suffered a major personal blow, and a sign of how serious for him it is provided by the fact that the media, I notice, is largely ignoring it. They're pretending that basically, or at least they're acting as if it didn't happen, or as if it isn't particularly important. And that blow is that the president's son has now been indicted. There's apparently 9 different charges. They appear to be, so far as I can tell, essentially about tax evasion and fraud. I'm not going to analyse the charges in detail, certainly not in this programme. I'm not going to discuss the outcome of any possible legal proceedings. I would simply say that the president's son, like everyone else who is the subject of an indictment, is entitled to the presumption of innocence, as everyone else in that kind of situation should be. But of course, we're not here talking about simple legal process, because the person indicted is the president's son. There have been claims that the president himself is connected to his son's business activities. There have been reports in the media. You can find a lot of detail about all of this, by the way, on Jonathan Turley's blog, Res Ipsa Loquitur. There's reports that some of the funds that the son was handling found their way to the president himself, which is indicative, even if it is not definitive, of anything very much. But I can't imagine that this isn't going to play badly for the president in the forthcoming election. And beyond that, of course, there is the issue of what personal effect it will have on the president that his son is now being indicted in this particular way. It will be a major distraction for him, at the very least. And to my way of thinking, by the way, it further calls into question whether he should be standing for the presidency in these sort of circumstances at all. But anyway, that's another topic for another day. So, given that this is so, given that the military situation in Ukraine is becoming increasingly bad, given that politically speaking, the administration seems to be in deep difficulties and worsening difficulties, given that Speaker Johnson has again been talking about possible impeachment proceedings against the president himself, given that the stance the Republicans in Congress are taking seem to be generally supported by the American people, why would the Republicans over the next 5 days want to change their stance? Now, I'm not saying that they won't. In politics, as I said, many things happen. But I'm starting to think, especially after the reports that I've seen of what actually happened in Congress last week, the Lloyd Austin exchange in particular, I'm starting to think that Republican hostility to the further funding of this war has now hardened, and that it is becoming irresistible. That in turn ought to ring alarm bells in Kiev, and the political leadership there needs to start thinking very carefully, something which I admit they've shown little sign of being able to do, about their own prospects. If US aid is indeed cut off, if Ukraine ceases to receive the weapons and equipment that they have been receiving from the United States, and already the amount of that has been declining. It's apparently now reduced to a trickle, and the same is the case from Europe. If the aid from the United States, the military aid, is cut off, if the economic aid is cut off also, and that is also starting to look like a real possibility, the United States seems most unlikely to continue to fund Ukraine in any form if military aid is cut off. And as for the European Union, they're having real difficulties at the moment agreeing on their €50 billion package for Ukraine for next year. The Hungarians and the Slovaks having made clear their own essential opposition to this. Well, if that is indeed so, then it becomes increasingly clear that their prospects, already bleak, are going to become more bleak still. Without financial support from the West, how do they keep their army, their police force, their civil service, the pensioners, the people on welfare systems, the university professors, the teachers, all of those paid? In these kind of situations, the government is reduced to doing one of three things: either raising taxes, but what exactly is Ukraine going to tax? Or cutting spending, which would mean cutting off pretty much the entire social system in Ukraine, the entire social society of Ukraine, off from their social system. Or, what is much more likely in Ukraine's case, they'll start to have to monetize their payments by printing money. And Ukraine has risked hyperinflation on several occasions. It came very close to it, in my opinion, in the winter of 2014-2015. It risked hyperinflation at one point last year. In every case, in each case, hyperinflation was avoided because Western governments came in and provided financial aid, stabilizing the currency and the financial system. But it's difficult to imagine that this time the Ukrainian government would have any choice. It would have to, or so it seems to me, in order to maintain payments, start to print money. And of course, the moment it starts to do that, in conditions where the Ukrainian economy barely functions, where tax revenues have all but collapsed, and given that it would also be funding a war in the process, it's difficult to see how a hyperinflation situation can possibly be avoided. If we go back to what happened in the American Civil War, the other conflict which I regularly compare this conflict to, well, you can see that that was exactly what ultimately happened to the Confederacy. The Confederacy found itself obliged to cover costs by printing banknotes. The result is that confidence in the currency collapsed, and towards the end of the war, the Confederacy was slipping into a hyperinflation situation. By the way, and for the record, the same was starting to happen to Germany in the last months of the Second World War, and the collapse of the currency that took place in Germany after the Second World War, a hyperinflationary episode which, for some reason, most people seem little familiar with. But anyway, that hyperinflation was to a great extent the product of massive overspending by the German government in the months before the final defeat. Just saying. So, one can easily see how the combination of a military crisis, which is intensifying every day, and a financial crisis and a loss of diplomatic and political support could prove terminal, not just for Ukraine's war effort, but for the state itself. Now, I have often said what I think Ukraine should do. It seems to me that in this kind of situation, especially if nothing can be put together over the course of next week, the correct thing for the Ukrainian government to do is to move forward forthwith, pick up the telephone, contact perhaps the Chinese government, ask them to assist in arranging some kind of mediation exercise and informing the Russian authorities that Ukraine is looking at a unilateral ceasefire. In other words, that it is accepting that the war is lost and that it will end its own fighting, and that thereafter it's prepared to sit down and discuss terms. Now, I understand that the Ukrainian political leadership themselves find that extremely difficult to do. I understand that President Zelensky himself perhaps cannot do that. Perhaps, given that that is the situation, and given that this is the situation, if President Zelensky cannot do it, then perhaps he should step aside and make a step for someone else. And if he won't step aside, perhaps the time has come for all of this talk of coups and such things to be enacted in some form by other Ukrainian officials, perhaps the military engaging in an Appomattox courthouse moment, or something of that kind. The only Ukrainian political figure, if he is a political figure, who does seem to have some sense of how catastrophic the situation has become, is Zelensky's former spin doctor, Alexei Arestovich, who's been making one astonishing statement after another. Astonishing, that is, if you recall the kind of things that he was saying a year or so ago. But he at least does seem to understand how critical the situation has become and the extent to which Ukraine now is short of time. Well, I don't expect anybody in Ukraine to be paying much attention to anything that I say, but there it is. Suffice to say that even if the Biden administration gets its way, some degree of funding is cobbled together over the next week, even if the Biden administration gets all the $61 billion that it is asking for, the trajectory of travel on the battlefield is now clear. It will not change. All that will happen is that the war will be prolonged for a few more months for no other purpose than the one that Emma Ashford gave us in that article in The Guardian, which is to assist President Biden, for all his other problems, to win re-election in November. Now, why Ukraine should sacrifice itself for that, I personally am completely unable to see. And I would have thought that Ukrainian officials, if they have an ounce of genuine patriotic feeling amongst them, if they care about the interests of Ukraine and their people, would now hurry up and do the sort of things that I've been saying and bring this disastrous war finally and conclusively to an end. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the situation with respect to Ukraine today. Now, I'm going to devote more time to this issue in my next video. But again, exactly as I predicted and have been predicting for months, we have seen another battle at the UN Security Council over the Gaza situation. And importantly, on this occasion, this demand that the Security Council heard last night, came not from a member state, but from the UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres. He made a request that the Security Council meet under Chapter 99 of the UN Charter on the basis that he, as UN Secretary General, now perceives a threat to peace from the situation in Gaza and the Middle East. That opened the way for the United Arab Emirates to propose a draft resolution calling for an immediate humanitarian and extended humanitarian pause, in other words, a ceasefire. The draft resolution also demanded immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, as well as humanitarian access to Gaza. The Security Council meeting was dominated by a passionate submission by UN Secretary General Guterres, who spoke about a catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza. And however, perhaps the most important comments of all were made by the ambassador of the United Arab Emirates, Mohammed Issa Abu Shahab, who noted that the resolution that his country had proposed, the one that sought a ceasefire, received co-sponsorship from at least 97 member states, UN member states, within 24 hours. It gives us a sense of the extent to which international opinion is now building. And the United States vetoed the resolution, and in doing so, it was abandoned by all its allies. Britain abstained, citing the fact that the resolution didn't criticise Hamas, an extremely weak speech, by the way, by the British representative. All of the other countries who are allies of the United States, Japan, Albania, France, Ecuador, they all voted, Switzerland, they all voted to support this resolution. And the United States was left alone, vetoing it. Now, that, of course, has happened many times before in the past, but already there are criticisms that by vetoing resolutions of this nature, the United States is becoming an accessory to the war crimes that many states are now saying are taking place in Gaza. The most important point, however, to understand is that this resolution attracted the support, the co-sponsorship of 97 states, UN states, within 24 hours. That tells us that the point where a UN resolution, perhaps a binding resolution, under the Partnership for Peace formula from the General Assembly is now approaching. The United States will not want that to happen. And in my opinion, rather than find itself in a situation where it would be outvoted in the General Assembly on a Uniting for Peace resolution, the United States would probably signal that it would allow a Security Council resolution in the form that the UAE has proposed to pass the Security Council. Now, that would be a major diplomatic defeat for the United States, and of course, it will open the way to further UN resolutions, Security Council resolutions, ultimately perhaps citing enforcement action under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, unless Israel eventually complies. Now, that would be an even greater disaster still. And again, I cannot imagine that the United States will ultimately let it happen. But this is the high-stakes game that is now being played in the General Assembly. The United States finding itself isolated. This is the most stark moment of its isolation in the diplomatic system up to this point, and Israel itself finding itself not just isolated, but increasingly condemned internationally, and therefore ultimately also coming under extreme pressure. Now, again, it's not perhaps for me to give advice, but I'm going to do so. I think that the correct and proper thing to do for the US government at this time is for President Biden himself, and it cannot be anyone else but him, to now telephone Prime Minister Netanyahu to explain to Prime Minister Netanyahu that the situation is now critical, that the point has been reached when the United States can no longer afford to protect Israel in the Security Council in the way that it has been doing, that to do so would entail enormous risks that the United States cannot accept, and to ask, or rather tell Prime Minister Netanyahu to agree to a ceasefire, a prolonged humanitarian pause right away. I am very sceptical, to put it mildly, that President Biden is going to do any such thing. But anyway, we will have to wait and see. Anyway, this finishes my video for today. This event in the Security Council is an important one, in my opinion. It's clear that there's been a lot of diplomatic activity going on over the last couple of days. I think that Putin's trip to the Arabian Peninsula has undoubtedly been part of the procedure, the diplomatic mechanics that have led us to this point. There's been a very interesting article on that very topic, by the way, by John Helmer at Dancing with Bears. But I'm going to return to all of that in my next programme, and I will be discussing these latest developments further. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Have a very good day, and let me just remind you once more that you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop and get yourself the amazing things you will find there. Our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, our magic mugs, all those amazing things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.